It is a little past 7 in the morning, and a man is standing on top of a levee, watching the Mississippi River try to climb over his feet. The water is the color of coffee, and it is moving fast. Behind him, 3/4 of a mile of earth is the only thing between the river and everything he has ever known. He does not know it yet, but in a matter of minutes, that earth is going to disappear beneath him. For weeks, the men of the Delta had been piling sandbags higher and higher. Their hands were raw. Their backs were broken. They had been told the same thing their fathers were told, and their grandfathers before them. Build the wall higher, and the river will stay where you put it. On the morning of April 21st, 1927, the river answered. At Mound's Landing, just north of Greenville, Mississippi, the levee did not leak. It did not crack. It exploded. A crevasse half a mile wide tore open, and a wall of water more than 100 feet deep came through, carrying twice the volume of Niagara Falls. Men who had been standing on that levee moments before were simply gone. This was not a natural disaster, not entirely. This was the moment America learned that you cannot wall in a river the size of a continent and expect it to forgive you. And it was the moment the people in power made a choice that would decide very precisely who among them would drown. The rain had come from the sky, but the drowning that followed was engineered, and then it was chosen. To understand how the water got that angry, you have to go back 50 years to a decision made in quiet offices by confident men who had never watched a levee fail. The Mississippi drains 1/3 of the United States. Rain falling in Montana, in New York, in the Rockies, all of it eventually funnels into one enormous channel that runs to the sea. And for centuries, that channel had done what rivers do. It flooded, it spread across the flatlands, it dropped its silt and rebuilt the land it had drowned. The floods were how the Delta had been made rich in the first place. But the land beside the river was some of the richest farmland on earth, and men wanted to live on it, farm it, get rich on it. So they built levees, walls of packed earth to hold the river back. And in the late 1800s, the government made those walls into a national religion. They called it the levees-only policy. The theory sounded almost elegant. If you wall the river in on both sides, the argument went, the trapped water has nowhere to spread, so it runs faster. And a faster river scours its own bottom deeper, digging out room for the next flood. Confine it, and it will dig its own escape. The engineers were certain. They refused to build a single spillway. They refused reservoirs. They refused any outlet at all. Just walls. Higher and higher, every year, for half a century. There was a fatal flaw in the elegant theory. A river with nowhere to go does not just run faster, it rises. Every levee built upstream shoved more water at the towns downstream. For 50 years, engineers were not taming the Mississippi. They were loading a gun and pointing it at the poorest people who lived beside it. The winter of 1926 going into 27, it rained like the end of the world. Not for days, for months. Storm after storm dumped water across the entire basin, from the Ohio Valley to the Great Plains. Tributaries that fed the Mississippi swelled and then overflowed. Rivers you have never heard of turned into torrents. By spring, the main channel was carrying more water than any living person had ever seen, and it was all headed for one narrow, walled-in corridor of the south. The river rose against its walls and pressed, and the walls, those proud walls the engineers had built so high, became the problem. There was nowhere for the water to go but up. In some places, the river crested higher than the rooftops of the towns behind the levee. Picture that for a moment. entire towns living below the level of the water, going about their day beneath a river held up by a ridge of dirt. And the dirt was starting to weep. Little springs of muddy water pushing through the base, the sign every levee man dreads. In the last weeks of April, the levees did not fail one at a time. They failed everywhere at once. Up and down the lower Mississippi, walls that men had trusted with their lives gave way, and the river spilled out across the flatland faster than a man could run from it. When it was over, the water covered an area you can barely picture, 27,000 square miles, an expanse the size of an entire country, drowned. In places, the flood stood 30 feet deep. 7 states went under. Farms, towns, whole counties simply vanished beneath a brown inland sea that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Around 500 people were killed, though in the poorest, blackest corners of the Delta, the true number was never counted, and almost certainly higher. 700,000 people were driven from their homes. It remains the most destructive river flood in the history of the United States. But the flood was not finished revealing what kind of country it had happened in. Because when the water came, the people in power had to decide who to save. And in 1927, in the Mississippi Delta, that decision was made along the lines you would expect. In the camps that formed on the high ground, the ground that had not gone under, 13,000 people were stranded on a strip of surviving levee near Greenville. Almost all of them were black, sharecroppers, the men and women who worked the plantations of the Delta for a share of a crop that somehow always seemed to leave them owing the landowner money at the end of the season. They were the poorest people in one of the poorest corners of the country, and now the river had taken even that. The plantation owners made a calculation. If the sharecroppers were evacuated to safety, they might board the boats and never come back. The Delta would lose its labor. And so, a decision was handed down. The black workers would not be taken to safety. They would stay on the levee, they would be kept. So 13,000 people were held on a ribbon of dirt 11 miles long, with the river on one side and the drowned world on the other. National Guardsmen stood watch, and the guns were not pointed at the water. They were pointed at the people. To leave the camp, a black refugee needed a pass. White people came and went as they pleased. And they were not only held, they were made to work, forced at gunpoint to haul sandbags, to labor on the very levees that had failed them, to load supplies onto boats they were not allowed to board. Men who tried to rest were beaten. Food and clean water went to the white refugees first. Disease moved through the crowded camps, and the sick had nowhere to go but the same wet ground everyone else was standing on. Word of these camps spread. Black newspapers reported the beatings, the forced labor, the passes, the guns. A black investigator sent quietly into the region documented it all, name by name, camp by camp. And something shifted in the country. Black families who had voted Republican since Abraham Lincoln freed their grandparents began for the first time to ask what that loyalty had ever actually bought them. Many of them stopped waiting for an answer. They packed what the water had left them and they went north, to Chicago, to Detroit, to St. Louis, to cities where a man might sell his own labor for his own wage and no armed guard could hold him on a levee. The flood of 1927 poured fuel on the Great Migration, one of the largest movements of people this country has ever seen, and the Delta the planters had tried so hard to keep began, quietly, to empty out. But the ugliest choice of the flood was still to come, and it would be made not in a plantation office, but in the finest rooms in New Orleans. Because as the river rose, The bankers and businessmen of the city looked at the water climbing toward their wealth, and they decided that someone else would have to drown for them. New Orleans sat behind its own levees, and the pressure of the river was building against them. The city's most powerful men, the bankers and the merchants who ran the place, were terrified, not only of the water, but of the panic. If it so much as looked like New Orleans might flood, the money would flee the city and never come back, and everything they had built would go with it. They needed to prove the city was safe, and to prove it they decided they needed a sacrifice. Their plan was simple and brutal. Downriver from the city sat the parishes of Saint Bernard and Plaquemines, poor, rural, full of trappers and fishermen and small farmers, many of them immigrants who spoke little English and had no lawyers, no newspapers, no way to fight back. If you blew a hole in the levee down there, the argument went, the river would drain into their land instead of the cities. Their homes were, to the men in the boardrooms, an acceptable loss. So on April 29th, they packed the levee at Carnarvon with 30 tons of dynamite. The people of St. Bernard and Plaquemines were told the flooding was necessary. To make it right, they were promised full compensation. Every home, every boat, every acre, pay for all of it. On that promise, they let the powerful men set the charges. The dynamite tore the levee open. 250,000 cubic feet of water per second roared through the gap and swallowed the parishes below. Homes went under. Boats, traps, herds, and gardens, everything a family had, gone in an afternoon. 2 rural communities were deliberately drowned so that the wealth of New Orleans would feel safe from a river that was coming for it, whether they blew the levee or not. And here is the part that turns the stomach. It was almost certainly unnecessary. Upriver, other levees had already broken on their own, bleeding off the pressure. New Orleans was very likely never in real danger. The powerful men had drowned 2 poor parishes to calm a panic that may never have needed calming. Then came the promise no one intended to keep. The people of St. Bernard and Plaquemines filed their claims for the full compensation they had been guaranteed. The system was designed to defeat them. No lawyers allowed in the room. No partial payments permitted. Claim after claim denied on a technicality nobody had warned them about. Of millions of dollars in damages, most families received nothing at all. The lucky few averaged a couple $100 for everything they had ever owned. So step back and look at what the flood of 1927 really was. Engineers spent 50 years turning the river into a prison, convinced their walls could hold it forever. When the river finally escaped, the powerful got to decide who would drown for it. Black sharecroppers held on the levee at gunpoint. Poor parishes blown open with dynamite. Promises made in daylight and never, ever paid. Out of the wreckage, one man rose. Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce, was put in charge of the relief effort, and he made sure the whole nation watched him do it. The photographs of Hoover directing rescue boats and organizing refugee camps ran in every newspaper in the country, and they turned an engineer nobody had heard of into a national hero. 2 years later, that reputation carried him all the way to the White House. What the cameras did not show was that some of those same relief camps were the ones holding black refugees behind armed guards. The hero of the flood built his legend, in part on a machine that was quietly imprisoning the people it claimed to be saving. The country would learn the truth only later. The disaster did force the engineers to admit they had been catastrophically wrong. In 1928, Congress passed the Flood Control Act and buried the levees-only policy for good. The new design finally gave the river room. Spillways, floodways, deliberate escape valves built into the system, so that when the Mississippi rose again, it would have somewhere to go besides up and over the walls and into people's homes. It was the exact idea the engineers had spent 50 years refusing to consider. It was a lesson written in 500 lives and 700,000 ruined ones. You cannot simply command a river to stay. 10 years later, in 1937, when the Ohio and Mississippi flooded again, the new floodways were opened on purpose, and the redesigned system held. The river had somewhere to go, so it did not have to take it. The levees along the Mississippi still stand today, taller and stronger than the ones that failed. But the river has not forgotten what it is. It still pushes, it still rises, and every high water season, the engineers who watch it remember the year they believed a wall could be certainty, and the water taught them the difference. Because in the end, the flood of 1927 was never really a story about water. It was a story about a country that built a prison for a river, and then, when the prison broke, reached for the people at the bottom and held them under so that the people at the top could stay dry. The river only ever did what rivers do. It rose. It found the low ground. The choosing, all of it, was ours.